Imagine a world where the strength of a man is not measured by his ability to dominate, but by his capacity to understand and empathize. Where being manly is not defined by aggression or emotional suppression, but by courage in vulnerability and diversity in expression. Today, we peel back the layers of what we've been told masculinity should be to explore what it truly can be. Welcome, hot fat guys, gals, and pals, to a crucial and timely discussion. In today's session, we're going to delve into the intricate world of masculinity and how deeply it influences high-profile contemporary social problems. Moving beyond the traditional and often limiting definitions of masculinity towards a more inclusive, holistic, and healthy understanding. Now, I want to make something abundantly clear. My criticism of masculinity may and probably will be interpreted by some as me denouncing men. I'm not. Masculinity is a prison that all of us are forced to live in, and in order to fix the problem, we must learn to show empathy and compassion for the boys and men who have been forced to believe that masculinity is obligatory. So first, let's define masculinity. In their book, The Tough Standard by Dr. Ronald Levant and Shana Pryor, they define masculinity as a set of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and behaviors that are generally considered to be appropriate for boys and men. Importantly, it also includes those that are considered inappropriate for boys and men, against which it has drawn a bright line. So what are these behaviors that are deemed appropriate and inappropriate for men? Before we can talk about that, let's talk about the 7 masculinity norms under the traditional masculinity index. The 7 masculinity norms are as follows. Number 1, the avoidance of all things feminine. Number 2, the restriction of the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions. Number 3 is self-reliance. Number 4 is toughness. Number 5 is dominance. Number 6 is a super high interest in sex, being a playboy, such like that. And number 7 is disdain for sexual, racial, and gender identity minorities. So what are those acceptable behaviors under TMI? The first would be emotional stoicism. Men are expected to be the sturdy oak, showing little to no vulnerability. Emotions like sadness or fear are often discouraged, while anger is far more acceptable. The next would be toughness and aggression. Physical strength, toughness, a willingness to use aggression if necessary or if not necessary are highly valued. This is often linked to the idea of men as protectors or defenders. Self-reliance. The expectation that men should be independent, self-sufficient, and not rely on others for emotional or practical support. Dominance. Men are often expected to assert control or dominance in various aspects of life, from personal relationships to professional environments. Restrictive emotionality. A limitation on the range of emotions men are allowed to express, often excluding expressions of affection or vulnerability. And lastly, achievement and success. A strong emphasis is placed on success, often in terms of career, financial status, or achievements. Like Andrew Tate's favorite stupid catchphrase, "Where's your Bugatti?" Ugh. Now, what are the unacceptable behaviors under traditional masculinity ideology? Number 1 is doing anything feminine ever. Number 2 would be showing vulnerability. Any display of emotional vulnerability, such as crying or expressing fear, is often stigmatized. Dependency. Relying on others for support or help is frequently seen as a sign of weakness. Non-aggressive behavior. Preferences for peaceful or non-aggressive approaches can be viewed as lacking masculinity. And expressing non-dominant emotions like empathy or tenderness or sadness is absolutely discouraged. And failure to conform to heteronormative and cisgender norms. Any deviation from heterosexual and cisgender norms is often met with scrutiny or hatred under TMI. And of course, non-competitive or non-ambitious attitudes. Lacking a drive for competition or ambition can be seen as unmasculine. These acceptable and unacceptable behaviors under traditional masculinity ideology not only restrict the emotional and physical expression of men, but also contribute to broader societal implications, including gender inequality, mental health issues, sexual violence, and gun violence. Now, this is exactly why I don't like the term toxic masculinity. Masculinity itself isn't toxic. Every human being in the world has a masculine and feminine side. The issue is that these norms of masculinity are so hard to meet that it turns men's minds into scrambled eggs when they can't conform to them 100% of the time. Toxic masculinity has become such a buzzword in the last decade or so, and across media and academic circles, the inconsistent definition is sparking vital conversations about gender roles, emotional health, and societal expectations. Here are several definitions from media sources. Toxic masculinity is built on two fundamental pillars: sexual conquest and violence. Qualities men regale as manly and virtuous. Toxic masculinity is thus defined by adherence to traditional male gender roles that restrict the kinds of emotions allowable for boys and men to express, including societal expectations that men seek to be dominant, the alpha male, and limit their emotional range primarily to expressions of anger. A social science term that describes a narrow repressive type of ideas about the male gender role that defines masculinity as exaggerated masculine traits like being violent, unemotional, sexually aggressive, and so forth. Also suggests that men who act too emotional or are maybe not violent enough or don't do all of the things that real men do can get their man card taken away. My definition of toxic masculinity is actions or beliefs that define manhood in such contrast to femininity as to reject and despise all things that are or are perceived to be feminine in such a way that it becomes harmful to men and to those around them. Toxic masculinity dictates that men should be stoic and strong both emotionally and physically. And in addition, the term has also entered the professional literature. Here's two examples. Toxic masculinity is the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. And toxic masculinity is characterized by a drive to dominate and by endorsement of misogynistic and homophobic views. Now, these several definitions of toxic masculinity taken together mention many of the 7 norms of traditional masculinity ideology that I spoke about earlier. To reiterate those points, they are, number 1, the avoidance of all things feminine. Number 2, the restriction of the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions, self-reliance, toughness, dominance, a high interest in sex, and disdain and hatred for sexual, racial, and gender identity minorities. Thus, the modifier of toxic is pointless to add, and in fact, it's misleading because it implies that masculinity itself is not problematic, which is absolutely not the case. Having set the stage with varying definitions of toxic masculinity, let's dive deeper into the heart of the issue. What makes the concept of masculinity problematic? This is a question that requires us to look beyond surface-level stereotypes and delve deep into the societal constructs that shape our understanding of these gender roles. First and foremost, the issue lies in the perceived obligation of masculinity. From a young age, boys and men are often conditioned to adhere strictly to traditional masculine norms, feeling as though they have no alternative but to conform to them. This mandatory performance of masculinity isn't paralleled in femininity ideology, where girls and women generally experience more flexibility in their gender expression. This stark contrast in gender performance highlights a fundamental inequality in how we perceive and enforce these roles. So let's bring to life the concept of rigid masculine norms versus the more flexible gender expression in femininity through a few hypothetical examples. These scenarios are going to help us visualize the societal conditioning that shapes the experiences of boys and men compared to boys and women. Example 1, emotional expression. From a young age, Jack is taught that boys don't cry. When he falls and hurts himself, his parents encourage him to be strong and to not cry, to not show tears, reinforcing the idea that emotional vulnerability is in fact a sign of weakness. As Chad grows, he becomes more reserved in expressing his emotions, feeling that showing sadness or fear would make him less of a man. Conversely, when Emily shows emotion after falling, she is comforted and allowed to express her pain and sadness openly. She's allowed to cry. Her emotional expression is seen as natural and acceptable, allowing her a broader range of emotional responses without the fear of being judged as weak. Now, let's talk about career choices. As a teenager, Chris feels a deep passion for nursing, a field often associated with care and empathy. However, he faces peer pressure and societal expectations to choose a career deemed more masculine, like engineering. Concerned about being judged or not fitting in, he may suppress his true interests to conform to traditional masculine career paths. But on the other hand, Sarah has both interests in engineering and nursing. She receives encouragement for either choice, and the societal narrative around women's careers has evolved to support them in both traditionally feminine and masculine roles, offering her a wider scope of acceptable career paths without the same level of judgment or pressure. And lastly, hobbies or interests. Let's say Teddy enjoys cooking and baking, activities that are often culturally labeled as feminine. And he hesitates to share this interest with his friends, fearing ridicule or being labeled as less manly. This pressure leads him to pursue more traditionally masculine hobbies in public, like sports or CrossFit, even if they don't interest him as much. Meanwhile, Julia enjoys both baking and playing soccer and CrossFit and boxing, and she's praised for her athletic skills and her culinary talents, experiencing little to no stigma for engaging in activities that cross traditional gender lines. Of course, these hypothetical scenarios depict how rigidly defined masculine norms can limit the choices, expression, and emotional well-being of boys and men. In contrast, girls and women face fewer restrictions in their gender expression, allowing for a more diverse and holistic development of their identities. As we delve deeper into the complexities of masculinity, a pressing question emerges. What accounts for the destructive outcomes often linked to masculinity? Here's a crazy yet not at all surprising statistic. 87% of violent crime in the United States is committed by males. You ready for the least surprising part? Most of that is committed by white men. Shocker. That's data from the Department of Justice in 2016, by the way. However, that 87% of violent crimes committed by men does not mean that most or all men are violent. The answer lies in the examination of those at the extreme end of the masculinity scale, the individuals who most rigidly endorse traditional masculinity ideologies. They conform to masculine norms or experience intense gender role conflict or stress, like Ron DeSantis and his high heels. He's insecure about his height and how he is perceived as a man because he's short. So he wears lifts in his heels to make him taller and seem more powerful. It's a small example, but an important one. Our understanding of these destructive correlates come from examining the upper tail of the masculinity distribution. These are men who don't just embrace traditional norms, but do so with an unyielding rigidity. This rigidity, as suggested by studies like that of Levant and colleagues, is a key factor in the harmful effects of traditional masculinity. It's the extreme adherence to these norms that give rise to problematic aspects of masculinity. And thus this brings us back again to the concept of toxic masculinity. While the term's been popularized in media and lacks a stable definition, it's important to understand its implications in the context of extreme masculinity. As highlighted in Carly's article, traditional masculine traits in moderation can have good value. Enjoying and participating in sports, for instance, is a positive expression. However, the line into toxic masculinity is crossed when these interests are used to belittle others, enforce unhealthy risk-taking, or uphold harmful stereotypes. Toxic masculinity, then, is not about the traits themselves, but how rigidly and extremely they are adhered to. It's when the enjoyment of traditionally masculine activities turns into a tool for exclusion, ridicule, or promoting dangerous behavior that it becomes problematic. This distinction is crucial in understanding the fine line between healthy expressions of masculinity and its quote-unquote toxic counterparts. Interestingly enough, the term traditional masculinity ideology, or TMI, is more commonly used in psychology, while hegemonic masculinity is a term more frequently used in sociology. Both arise from a feminist social scientific perspective, with TMI focusing on the cultural beliefs that inform men's practices, and hegemonic masculinity highlighting the practices that promote the dominance of privileged men over others. These ideologies are measured using scales like the Brandon Masculinity Scale, the BMS, and the Male Role Norms Inventory short form, the MRNISF, which capture norms such as avoidance of femininity, toughness, dominance, and restrictive emotionality. These scales ask respondents to agree or disagree with statements about how men should think, feel, and behave, offering insight into the extent of adherence to these norms. As we delve deeper into the fabric of masculinity, we encounter a crucial aspect. the diversity of masculine expressions across cultures and communities. Masculinity, as defined by the GRSP, the Gender Role Strain Paradigm, is a set of cultural expectations shaping how boys and men are supposed to think, feel, and behave. These expectations shared across genders vary significantly among different subcultures. We will cover all of these scales in more detail in future videos, but if you're impatient and studious and want to do some of your own research, I've linked the papers that each of these come from in the video description, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe as well. In the United States, this diversity is evident. Yet, despite this diversity, there has been a dominant form of masculinity in the United States, especially before the feminist movement of the late 1960s. This dominant masculinity can be characterized as white, post-World War II, Christian, cisgender, heterosexual masculinity, a reflection of the predominant race, religion, gender identity, and sexual orientation in the country. This version of masculinity has been so deeply ingrained in the culture of the United States that it impacts all boys and men, regardless of their background. But what's particularly fascinating is the emergence of hybrid or inclusive masculinities. Hybrid masculinities involve privileged men selectively incorporating elements associated with marginalized masculinities and femininities, while inclusive masculinities reflect a decline in cultural homophobia. With young men comfortably expressing affection and respect towards other men and having positive attitudes towards sexual minorities. So how do these diverse forms of masculinity interact with and challenge the dominant narrative? How do these varied expressions impact the lives of men and boys across different cultures and communities? Well, these concepts represent a seismic shift in traditional views of masculinity, challenging long-held norms and paving the way for more diverse and accepting expressions of masculinity. So I want to just define these very clearly real quickly. Hybrid masculinity involves men, often from privileged backgrounds, who adopt and integrate elements traditionally associated with marginalized groups and femininities. For example, a corporate executive, typically seen as a symbol of traditional masculinity, might actively engage in caregiving roles at home or champion gender equality in the workspace. This blending of masculine norms with traits and roles traditionally seen as other disrupts the conventional narrative of what it means to be a man, allowing for a more nuanced and multidimensional expression of their masculinity. Inclusive masculinities signify a decline in cultural homophobia and a move towards greater emotional openness among men. Young men today are increasingly comfortable expressing affection and respect toward other males, fostering close emotional ties without fear of their masculinity being questioned. This shift also includes more positive attitudes towards sexual minorities, challenging the rigid heteronormative standards that have long dominated masculine culture. Interactions with the dominant narrative. Now, these diverse forms of masculinity interact with the dominant narrative by challenging and gradually These diverse forms of masculinity interact with the dominant narrative by challenging and gradually dismantling the rigid structures of traditional masculinity. They offer alternative ways of being a man that are not predicated on dominance or emotional restriction or homophobia. And by doing so, they provide men and boys with a broader range of acceptable masculine expressions, allowing them to explore aspects of their identity that were previously stigmatized or suppressed. Now, the impact of these evolving masculinities is profound and far-reaching. Men and boys who embrace hybrid or inclusive masculinities often experience greater emotional freedom and psychological well-being. They are less likely to adhere to harmful stereotypes and more likely to engage in healthy, respectful relationships. In diverse cultural contexts, these expressions of masculinity can serve as bridges, reducing cultural and gender-based stereotypes and promoting a more inclusive society. Furthermore, these changes in masculinity norms can have a ripple effect across communities. They can influence attitudes towards gender roles. Reduce gender-based violence, and foster greater acceptance of diversity and sexual identities. In essence, hybrid and inclusive masculinities not only redefine what it means to be a man, but also contribute to a more equitable and empathetic world. We now turn to one of my favorite questions. Do most men actually endorse traditional masculinity norms? And contrary to what some might expect, the reality is more complex and less clear-cut. In my personal experience, it's always the loudest, most obnoxious, and most insecure portions of the male population that ruin everything for the rest of us. Those select few men that most endorse and conform to these norms and convince as many other young men as possible that they have to as well. Guys like Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, any red pill creator. These people then make it worse for everyone else. And unfortunately, social media algorithms love to boost manosphere content creators, and their content performs well because of the outrage they sow and the vulnerability of their extremely impressionable audiences who are either looking to confirm grievances that they have with women or to mask their own insecurities about how they don't conform to the tough standards of masculinity. Believe me, it's much easier to pretend to be an alpha male than to really do the work to figure out why you hate yourself. But I digress. Recent studies, including assessments using tools like the CMNI, Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory, reveal that the majority of men do not strongly endorse traditional masculinity ideologies. This finding challenges the common perception that most men actively and fully embrace these norms. But what about conformity to these norms? It's one thing to endorse an ideology, and it's another to live by it. Here, the situation is equally nuanced. While some men may not explicitly endorse these norms, the degree to which they conform to them can be different. Data shows that the distribution of men's conformity to masculine norms is varied. With a mean score slightly above the neutral point on the CMNI scale, it suggests that a slight majority may lean towards conforming to these norms. However, it's crucial to note that a significant portion of men report a lack of conformity or endorsement of these norms. This data indicates a crucial point. The landscape of masculinity is diverse. Men's experiences, beliefs, and behaviors with regard to gender norms are not monolithic, but varied and complex. It dispels the myth that all men are bound tightly to traditional masculine roles and behavior. Instead, it reveals a spectrum of attitudes and practices among men, reflecting a more realistic and humanized view of masculinity. As we explore this diversity, we've got to ask ourselves, what does this mean for our understanding of masculinity? How can we foster an environment where men feel free to express themselves beyond the confines of traditional norms? While most boys grow up under the pressure to conform to traditional masculinity norms, the story often changes as they transition into adulthood. The evolution in perspective is key to understanding the relationship between individual identity and societal expectations. Now, the common sense explanation for the divergence between childhood pressures and adult realities lies in the journey of self-acceptance. As many men mature, they come to terms with the messages they received during their childhoods. They begin to recognize that their unique personalities and individual qualities may not and do not need to, quite frankly, align perfectly with the rigid ideals of traditional masculinity. It's a realization that masculinity, often portrayed as an inflexible and tough standard, is not the sole measure of their worth or identity. This process of self-acceptance is both liberating and challenging. It involves men having to grapple with, and in many cases, move beyond the confines of the norms they were taught and or forced to value. They learn that being true to themselves, with their diverse traits and experiences is more important than adhering to a prescribed set of characteristics. This shift is not just about personal growth, it's about reshaping the very concept of masculinity to be more inclusive, realistic, and humane. So, in conclusion, toxic masculinity is not about the traits themselves, but how rigidly and extremely they are adhered to. It's when the enjoyment of traditionally masculine activities turns into a tool for exclusion, ridicule, or promoting dangerous behavior or violence that it becomes problematic. This distinction is crucial in understanding the fine line between healthy expressions of masculinity and its quote-unquote toxic counterparts. Only together can we destroy this prison of masculinity that we are all forced to live in. Only together can we create a new, holistic masculinity with more ways to be a man than we ever could have imagined. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the Hot Fat Guy Club, or leave me any hate comments if I made you angry. Take up space, my friends. Hot Fat Guy out.